I'd like to call to order the November 7th meeting of the James City County Planning Commission. Mr. Holt, will you please call the order?
Ms. Leverins.
Here.
Ms. Leverins is an at-large member. Mr. Polster.
Here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Mr. Haldeman.
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. O'Connor, who is an at-large member, could not be with us this evening. Mr. Kropp.
Here.
Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District. Mr. Richardson, who is our chairman this year, who represents the Stonehouse District, could not be with us as well. Mr. Schmidt.
Here.
Mr. Schmidt represents the Roberts District and is this year's vice chair. We have a quorum.
All right, thank you, Mr. Holt. This portion of the meeting, we move on to the public comment period, and we'll go ahead and open that period. Would any members of the public like to come forward this evening to speak? And seeing and hearing none, we will close the public comment period and move on to reports of the commission. And we have one report tonight, the Development Review Committee report from the chair of the DRC, Mr. Kropp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Development Review Committee met at 4 p.m. on October 24th, 2018. Mr. Polster, Mr. Schmidt, and I were present to review two cases. Site Plan 0047-2018, 4521 John Tyler Highway, McDonald's site improvements. The applicant requested DRC approval for a new exterior color for an existing McDonald's restaurant. Condition 1 in the 1993 special use permit requires that all building designs, including paint colors, be approved by the DRC. By a vote of 3-0, the DRC approved the proposed new color, which was a beige, for the exterior of the building. Second case was Conceptual Plan 18-0091, 4621 Ware Creek Road, overhead utility waiver. Section 24-200C of the zoning ordinance requires all new utility connections to be placed underground. The applicant requested a waiver to this requirement, which may be approved by the Planning Commission if recommended by the DRC. During the past several months, the applicant has been attempting to acquire an easement through Dominion Energy to extend service from a nearby power pole to a proposed location for a new single-family home. The applicant received permission from the adjacent property owner to use an existing power pole and extend the overhead line through the utility easement over Ware Creek Road to a pole on his property. However, the neighbor would only allow overhead power line due to farming activities that take place on the property. Once the power line reaches the pole on the applicant's property, it will then go to a transformer and run underground to the house. Based on these facts, the DRC voted 3-0 to approve the waiver request, and with the condition that the easement be recorded in the Williamsburg James City County Courthouse within 30 days of Planning Commission approval. After the two cases, there was a brief discussion period amongst DRC members who asked staff when the Planning Commission will have an opportunity to provide discussion topic inputs for the upcoming comprehensive plan review. Topics of interest include agricultural and forestal districts, purchase of development rights, primary service area, and protections for rural lands. Staff stated they would research this and respond. And that concludes my report, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you, Mr. Kropp. We move on to the consent agenda, which includes two items, case numbers from Mr. Kropp's report. So we have those two items, and we have the minutes of the October 17, 2018 meeting of the special meeting that the Planning Commission held. And this is an opportunity, if any of my fellow commissioners would like to poll any of these items for discussion, we can do that now. Otherwise, may I have a motion?
Motion to approve the consent agenda, Mr. Chair.
And for that, we have a voice vote. All right. Seconded, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, and we move on to public hearings, and there are no public hearings. So hopping right ahead tonight to the Planning Commission considerations, and we have two Planning Commission considerations tonight, and Mr. Holt will be presenting both of these items. Afterwards, we will have some time for discussion, and we then will need to have, I guess, two separate votes that are going to require a roll, the roll being taken. Mr. Holt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission. Good evening. As mentioned, you have two items on your agenda tonight under Planning Commission considerations. Because they're relatively straightforward, I'll do my best to do staff impersonations and handle them on their behalf. The first one under item G1 on your agenda is an initiation of consideration of amendments to the zoning and subdivision ordinance to address a Code of Virginia change that prohibits mandatory conceptual plans. During the 2018 session of the General Assembly, the state code was changed to read that the local planning commission or the local agent cannot require pre-submission conferences, meetings, or reviews prior to the submission of any formal development plans. After consultation with the county attorney's office, it's staff's understanding that the prohibition regarding the requirement for pre-submission reviews would also apply to conceptual plan submissions. A process for the submission of and review of conceptual plans has been part of the county's development codes for a very long time as a recommended best practice and as a recommended step. In 2016, the Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors passed and put into the code a mandatory conceptual plan process. This change here at the state code effectively now prohibits those, so we're essentially going to have to undo that 2016 change, fortunately. Staff recommends the Planning Commission adopt the resolution contained in your agenda packets. As mentioned previously, this initiating resolution is a procedural step that's required by state code. It does not change the zoning ordinance. It does not constitute a public hearing, and again, does not change any of the text in the ordinance. It's really a procedural step. And by adopting this resolution, this matter will be referred back to the Policy Committee for further study, and when that body has made its reviews and recommendations, the proposed ordinance amendment will come back to the Planning Commission for a public hearing, and then on to the Board of Supervisors for a public hearing.
Well, the General Assembly action eliminates the requirement for a conceptual plan. There's still nothing to preclude an applicant from voluntarily doing a conceptual plan. Is that correct?
That is correct. And under the proposed ordinance amendment, to kind of undo the 2016 amendment and to kind of go back to the way it was, the language recommending that as an optional step would remain back into the code.
We're considering amending this ordinance that was just passed 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago. And the resolution reads that we're doing it. We're of the opinion that public necessity, convenience, general welfare, and good zoning practice warrant this consideration. But if public necessity, convenience, and general welfare and good zoning practice were important, we wouldn't have passed this zoning ordinance in the first place 2 years ago, I wouldn't think, having a lot of respect for the Board of Supervisors. I think the only reason we're considering this is because it's another state mandate, right? It's plain and simple. Can't we just say that?
So yeah, we have Assistant County Attorney.
Some options.
My mic's live here, or if Chris got me going. Probably don't need it. Yes, absolutely. The commission can adopt a resolution.
Excuse me, for the public record, perhaps you should be on a microphone.
I think I'm live now. I got a light.
Yep.
Okay.
For you.
Okay. The commission can adopt a resolution by motion that initiates changes, as Paul mentioned. It's a procedural step. The requirement in the state code for that procedural step is that it identifies one of the public purposes that's outlined in the state code, which would be the public necessity, convenience, general welfare, good zoning practice that Mr. Haldeman mentioned previously, and that's the language that is our standard initiating resolution language.
So do we have to identify a public necessity, convenience, general welfare, or good zoning practice that is advanced by this zoning amendment?
No, the interpretations of this section have said you don't. The commission doesn't have to go into a substantive discussion of what those are. It's simply a kind of a checkbox procedural issue. I do think the suggested edit that Mr. Haldeman put forth to the group would satisfy the requirements of state code if you were to make a motion amending the resolution, or if your motion amended the resolution that staff had proposed. It just has to contain at least one of those categories that would qualify as initiating a resolution or initiating an amendment to one of the ordinances.
With that being the case, I would like to make a motion to.
Could I ask a question in the meantime? I mean, would the state code requirements constitute public necessity?
Absolutely, that would be a fair way to interpret
I've got kind of a question. I may be twisting at windmills, which I'm known to do. In some of the cases that I've seen that we've looked at, especially in the rural lands areas, we're lucky to see a conceptual plan that talks about some details that I'm interested in terms of stormwater, et cetera, at least at the DRC level. And it makes a difference, especially when you're looking at some of these lands and the terrain and the topography and the environmental impacts that we're going to have, especially when we're trying to put what amounts to minor subdivisions into some of these areas. It's not just a one-house type thing in those rural lands. And it compounds itself, in my mind, when we get to the Planning Commission side and we get the documentation and we're looking at it, and the details that you would get in the engineering diagrams of that aren't there or aren't required either. So we're making decisions, at least on the environmental side, without any idea of being to assess the impacts of how the drainage works into the RPA, the outfalls, those sorts of things that aren't evident. And they're not evident in the conceptual plans at this point because of what we're talking about. And it's not likely that we're going to see any level of detail when it finally gets to the Planning Commission. So I'd like to, when you do look at the language that you're going to use, it is a new workflow process that we're now talking about how we look at these issues, especially with the minor subdivisions that we're looking at the rural land. So I'd ask you to take a look at that aspect of the process of how we're going to be able to review the documentation to be able to make a sensible recommendation or decision to the board.
So, and it sounds like there's still, per Mr. Holt's introduction to this tonight, that there's still going to be some time for wiggle room in crafting these changes to keep up with the state mandate. But I do think both of you have made good points, and Mr. Haldeman's rewording, that seems logical to me.
Again, I think I would be very surprised if eliminating the requirement for a conceptual plan actually reduces the number of conceptual plans significantly. I think it's been my experience over the years that applicants actually prefer this conceptual plan process before they put a lot of money into
Detailed engineering diagrams. That's exactly the point.
And of course, the more detailed engineering diagrams come after the legislative action anyway, at the site plan stage, when they have to specifically look at placements of BMPs and topography and that sort of thing. So, you know, I find personally that the conceptual plans are very valuable, and I would hope that the applicants would continue to submit them. But I do think that Mr. Haldeman made a good point with his suggestion on the wording. So that's.
Well, with that in mind, I'd like to make a motion that we amend, pardon me, the fourth paragraph of the mandatory conceptual plan resolution and the fifth paragraph of the ADA resolution, both of which are identical, and read, whereas the commission is of the opinion that the public necessity, convenience, general welfare, and good zoning practice warrant the consideration of amendments to the subdivision and zoning ordinance. I'd like to change that wording to, whereas the commission is of the opinion that conforming to state code is good zoning practice and warrants the consideration of amendments to the subdivision and zoning ordinance.
So we have a motion on the floor, Mr. Holt. Now, would we just add that onto the full motion?
It sounded like, Mr. Haldeman, you wanted to make that part of your motion. I was going to restate the motion just for clarity of the commission members.
Thank you.
That the initiating resolution in your agenda packets as it relates to ending the zoning ordinance as it relates to mandatory conceptual plans, that for this particular initiating resolution, the fourth paragraph be changed to read, whereas the commission is of the opinion that conforming to state code is good zoning practice and warrants the consideration of amendments to the subdivision and zoning ordinance.
Yeah, and you want to do both at the same time? Or
Now, we need separate
okay.
votes.
Right. Yes, that says it perfectly.
If that's your motion for approval.
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Mr. Krupp?
Aye.
And Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
We've got the,
I'd like to make another motion, please, for,
Let me just read that item into the minutes, if I can. So again, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Agenda item G2 tonight is initiation of consideration of amendments to the zoning ordinance to authorize the Board of Zoning Appeals to grant a reasonable modification in accordance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Again, the resolution that's before you is similar to the last one. This initiates a procedural step that's required by state code. The amendment that's talked about in this is, again, another requirement that the General Assembly mandated as part of the 2018 adoption of state code.
yeah, thank you, Mr. Holt. And any discussion on that front? I think I know where we're headed.
Just might mention this one does seem to me to be just a good idea on its merits, and wondering whether we really need an amendment to go with this.
I think the real reason we're doing this amendment is because we've been mandated for the reason. There may be other good reasons to do it, but that's the only reason it was brought here tonight, I think. Am I right about that? Therefore, I'd like to move that we amend this resolution, specifically the fifth paragraph, which reads, "The Commission is of the opinion that the public necessity, convenience, general welfare, and good zoning practice warrant this consideration of amendments to the subdivision and zoning ordinance." Change that to read, please, whereas the Commission is of the opinion that conforming to state code is good zoning practice and warrants the consideration of amendments to the subdivision and zoning ordinance.
Motion on the floor to recommend approval as amended. Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Polster?
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman?
Aye.
Mr. Krupp?
Aye.
And Mr. Schmidt?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries.
Okay. Thank you. We're moving on to the Planning Director's report. Mr. Holt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the commission. Other than what's been printed and is contained within your agenda packets, I don't have anything additional to add this evening, but I'd be certainly happy to answer any questions.
Anyone have any questions for Mr. Holt regarding the report? All right. Thank you, Mr. Holt. And now to Planning Commission discussion and requests. Mr. Haldeman.
Where are we in the CIP process? Probably begun with the appropriation requests, I assume, but...
It has. We are in the process now where the department heads are submitting their applications. If you'll remember last year, we began the process for the work that the Planning Commission does. We began the process of moving more to an online system, really to facilitate the work that the Policy Committee does in that. We are incorporating sort of the next step of those. Our current goal and hope is right now that as part of your December policy committee meeting, we'll do a little bit more training on that piece and show you the new elements of the online system to facilitate your review of the applications and the ranking. I think we're going to be back into it soon.
That year just flew by. It seems like just yesterday we were working on the CIP. All right, anyone else for discussion? All right, may I have a motion to wrap it up?
Move to adjourn?
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, opposed.
All right, good job, Danny.
Thank you. I jumped.